Welcome and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our 25th Annual Book Festival of the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. I'm Julie Solberg. I'm the president of the Jewish Federation's Board of Governors, and we have a lot of people to thank today. First of all, thank you to the University of La Verne for partnering with us on this event and continuing to show your support of people of all backgrounds and cultures. Your partnership with us over the years has meant a lot. Thank you to our dedicated committee members, our advanced readers, the Federation staff, and our hardworking coordinator, Rebecca Russell. The Jewish Book Council in New York, from which we chose many of our authors, our tech wizard, Jake, in New York, and our literary circle members, whose financial support make events like this possible. Before we move forward, it is important to note that this event commemorates the atrocities committed on Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. The University of La Verne annually recognizes this terrible event so that we will not forget and let history repeat itself. Let us take a moment to reflect on those that were lost. Thank you. This evening's program will be a presentation by Richard Hurowitz, followed by a question and answer period. Please go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions at any time. The chat will be disabled. The closed caption has been enabled for today's event and can be controlled by the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you wish to purchase any of our books for the book festival, you can do that at any of our in-person Jewish Book Festival events. And now it is my privilege to introduce Xander Wagner, PhD, chaplain at the University of La Verne, an ally in fighting against hatred in all forms.
Thank you, Julie. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Xandra Wagner, serve as the University Chaplain at the University of La Verne. I am really delighted to add my welcome to each of you here for this afternoon's lecture. The university has had a very special relationship and partnership with the Jewish Federation of the Greater San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. We are in our 13th year of this partnership to meet and in remembrance of Kristallnacht and to learn together. This annual lecture series gives our university and our local community the opportunity to focus together on Jewish history and experience, to make links between the past and our own challenges today, and to gather in a spirit of remembrance and reflection. And it's just good to be together in community. This act keeps us in the energy of learning, remembering, hope, and wisdom, and helps us keep the future that we're all seeking for. Thank you for being here. I'm delighted to introduce our featured speaker and author today, Richard Hurowitz. Mr. Hurowitz is a writer, investor, and the publisher of the Octavian Report, the magazine of ideas. He is the chief executive officer of Octavian and Company, LLC, an investment firm. He received his BA in history from Yale University and earned a JD from Columbia University School of Law. During his career, he founded Octavian Advisors, named as one of the top large global hedge funds by Bloomberg, and successfully invested in over 50 countries on 5 continents. His experience with investment and hedge funds has been matched with his contributions to the public good. He serves on the governing board of the Yale University Art Gallery, is a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, which is dedicated to effective global economic and financial cooperation. He is also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's co-founder and president of Renewed Democracy Initiative, an organization dedicated to defending liberal democracy. His commitment to the public good includes his many contributions of writings. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, just to name a few. He is here with us today because he has authored a new book on Holocaust rescuers. The title is In the Garden of the Righteous, the heroes who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The book was published by HarperCollins in January of this year. Thank you, Mr. Hurowitz. We are delighted to have you here with us today to share your research and your writing with us. I turn this over to you and we look forward to your words.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who is here. It's a great honor to be part of this festival and to be the speaker for Kristallnacht. I hope I'll explain to you a bit about my book and about rescue, and I hope this brings some degree of hope to you today in what is very difficult times. The tone and sort of some of the questions that we've I've had about the book have certainly taken on a bit of a different tone since October 7th. So I'm happy to talk about kind of the relevance today, in the wake of the war, a day when the most Jews were killed since the Holocaust. But the book, as was mentioned, is about people who risked their lives and in some cases gave their lives to rescue Jews and other people who were being persecuted by the Nazis during World War II. So I'll start the conversation with I'm often asked when the book started, and for me the book really started actually when I was in college, on the left is just a picture of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and it opened around the time I was studying history at Yale. And my family has been in this country for many generations. So actually, we were fortunate that we were not affected directly by the Holocaust. But like a lot of American Jews, we went down to see the exhibit. And for anybody who's been to the exhibit and has been through the museum, it's a very, very difficult experience. It's intentionally so. It's very different than Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, in my opinion, which sort of ends on a hopeful note. And so here, they really, try to, I think, hit you over the head as much as possible with the, atrocities of the Holocaust. And obviously, it's for a general audience, many of whom may not know what the Holocaust is. I actually was asked on the radio when I had been kind of touring around in Arizona. I even had one interview where I was asked to explain to the listeners what the Holocaust was. So, in any event, as I've actually spoken to a lot of different types of audiences, both Jewish and non-Jewish, anybody who's been to the museum seems to have one image in particular that sticks with them, which is the one on the right, which is this pile of shoes from victims of the concentration camps. And I remember this very clearly at the time. If you look closely, you'll see that many of the shoes are in children's sizes. So we always have to remember that 1.5 million of the 6 million Jews who died during the Holocaust were children. And that is, we've seen echoes of that recently. So in any event, at the time, I found this extremely overwhelming, as a lot of people do. And we can talk about how sort of the story of rescue fits into that. But it was extremely enervating, very traumatic to go through the exhibit. And I remember at the time coming out to a small room that they had dedicated to rescue. And I saw these group of pictures, and I gravitated to the guy on the left, whose name is Alexander Schmorell. And all these kids that you see in front of you were members of a group called the White Rose. And I think, I was particularly interested in their story because they were, for the most part, a little bit older than I was at the time. They were mostly medical students. And I just remember this kind of, very, jaunty, carefree picture of the guy on the left. And then on the right, you see other members of the group. And in particular, on the left is Hans Scholl, who was the prime mover of this group, and his sister is in the middle, Sophie Scholl. And what they were was basically a group, there were a core group of 6 of them, but they were a group of young, idealistic students in Germany who tried to foment an uprising against Hitler. And they talked a lot about, this is not the Germany that we know. This is not the land of Beethoven and Goethe. And they did this for the most part through circulating leaflets to other students. And they were circulated all over Germany to different universities. They got as far as Vienna. They also sent them to just ordinary people's homes in the mail. And it was kind of a clandestine operation. And actually the second leaflet of the 6, which was authored by the guy on the left, it's actually one of the first documents to publicize the Holocaust. And one of their critiques was the treatment of the Jews. And they said that something like over 300,000 Jews have already been killed in the most bestial way. Then what happened was they were sent, the boys at least were sent out to the front in Russia. They came back even more horrified. There's a wonderful story of Hans Scholl jumping from his troop transport because he saw a young Jewish girl at hard labor by the side of the road, and he ran over and he gave her a daisy for her hair and a chocolate bar from his rations. And they came back and they served as medics because they were medical students, and they tried to continue with their leaflets, and there was other sort of forms of protest, graffiti, etc. And then one day the Scholl siblings were at the University of Munich, and they were leaving the leaflets for people to pick up during classes. And so there was when the bell rang, and they were leaving them, and they went up the staircase to the top of what was basically an atrium. And Sophie Scholl had a number of extra leaflets in her like valise, and she took them out and she threw them down the atrium, and they kind of floated down. And the maintenance man saw this. He was an ardent Nazi. He locked the door, called the Gestapo. They were there within minutes, and 3 of them were arrested: the Scholls and one of their colleagues. The other 3 would be arrested later, shortly thereafter. They were put on trial. It was a pretty well-known case. Actually, Hitler sent his favorite judge down from Berlin to preside over it. Thomas Mann talked about it on the radio from exile in the United States. Later, the British would put the leaflets over, drop them over from planes over Germany. But this trial happened very quickly. Within days, they were put on trial and summarily executed. And the thing about it was that so Sophie Scholl, who today I think in Germany there are more schools named for the Scholls than anybody else, and so they very much want everyone to that's how Germany, and I think Germany's been better than other countries on kind of reckoning with the Holocaust, but they would like you to think, they would like to think of themselves that everyone was like these very tragic, very idealistic, very beautiful people. And one thing that struck me was during the testimony in her trial, Sophie said something like, everybody in Germany feels the way we do. They're just afraid to say it. And of course, this was completely not true, right? Most people did not agree with them. Most people either went along with what happened or actively collaborated, took advantage of the situation. And Hitler had a secretary who later wrote her memoirs. And she saw that one day a monument to Sophie Scholl, and she realized that she'd been born the same year as her. And she said in her memoirs, she really had no excuse for what she did. It didn't matter how young she was, that she, in this case was like an active part of the Nazi regime. So this story really stuck with me. I thought about doing my thesis on it, but I didn't know German. So, but I never really forgot about it. And it sort of sparked this interest in rescue that I have had ever since. And then a few years ago, on the 75th anniversary of their execution, I wrote an article for the New York Times, basically a memorial piece about them. And the article went completely viral. It was shared, immediately trended to the top of the New York Times. It was shared extremely widely on social media, and read tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times. And whenever that happens, you end up scouring the internet for what people are saying and the comments, and the internet is, as we all know, a pretty scary place, and seems to be particularly friendly to people who like to post things like swastikas. And what was amazing was that there was absolutely no negative anti-Semitic feedback. It was all positive. Everyone was inspired. It happened right around the time of the Parkland shooting, so people were drawing a connection between the students at Parkland and the White Rose. And it just was an enormously positive response, and a very, very powerful response. So I started writing up these stories of rescue for other publications. I did another one for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I had an article about the King of Morocco in the LA Times that went to #2 on Reddit. My children had to explain to me what Reddit was, but this was read by many, many, many people. It was the only article that went higher was a girl going to the prom with a cardboard cutout of Danny DeVito. So this got to a very general audience. And again, after writing 7 of these articles, I still had no kind of anti-Semitic, no bigoted response to it, all positive. So I decided, it felt like there was some real hunger in the world for positive stories of hope. Many of the people in my book are, probably amongst the greatest. These are some of the greatest acts of heroism in the history of mankind. Most of them are completely unknown, and so I decided to turn this into a book, which tells 10 stories of rescue across Europe. 10 very different types of stories. I'll give you a little taste of some of them, but they are across Europe, different professions, different types of people who rescued different reasons, but they're all amazing. And there's also I try to explore, and I'll get into a little bit of that, like what we can learn from the rescuers, why they did it, why certain communities rescued, and what kind of lessons can we learn, from today. Rescue is very studied as a field, and this is kind of really important to think about, because why is it that everyone knows Raoul Wallenberg, and then after the movie everyone knows Oskar Schindler, and some people know the story of Denmark, and once you get past that, most rescuers are completely unknown. And there were some reasons for that. I mean, my book, obviously, I'm trying to correct that to some degree. I think, first of all, why have the rescuers been so understudied and so ignored? I think there's a few reasons. First of all, immediately after the war, people were very interested and very disturbed by the evil that had gone on. Why did people perpetrate these crimes? Why did people go along with it? Why did they collaborate? Why did people stand by? And so you had things like, on the left is the picture of the Milgram experiments at Yale, tried to understand why people just followed orders. The Stanford prison experiments and other, all of that focused on people who did evil. We'll get into it, but there are very few studies that were actually done of rescuers while they were still alive. So that's one thing that happened. Another thing is that, for a variety of reasons, the rescuers were essentially silent about about what they had done. And I'll talk about it in a minute, about why that was. But there was sort of particularly in the post-war era, a reticence to talk about rescue. And then, the one thing I am a little bit sympathetic to is that, that first generation of survivors, many of whom had survived concentration camps, most of them weren't rescued. And so there was this feeling, even though at Yad Vashem from the very beginning in Jerusalem, one of the core missions has been to pay tribute to what are called righteous among the nations. And even at the dedication of the Garden of the Righteous, which my book is named after, Golda Meir called these people drops of love in an ocean of poison. And she said that the Jewish people owe them a debt of gratitude forever and always. But they were very, very, very rare. Now, there have been about 27,000 people recognize at Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. And there's very, very strict criterion for that. You have to have risked your life. You have to have, you can't be Jewish. You have to have eyewitness testimony. So, if you want to think about, that doesn't capture people who tried to rescue and failed. It doesn't talk about people who did things that were, maybe, didn't rise to that level. But even if you multiply by 100, it's still a vanishingly small portion of the population of 500 million people who lived in Europe at the time. I try to give an example. In New York, I use Madison Square Garden. I guess in California near LA, you would use, I guess the basketball stadium used to be the Staples Center. I looked up before, it's the crypto.com center. But just to give you a sense, if you filled up that stadium, or you filled up Madison Square Garden with a representative sample, you would have one person who was a righteous among the nations. So there was this view, not to distort the record and make more of something that was so rare. But as the next generation of survivors kind of came of age, and a number of people who, including my friend Abe Foxman, who used to run the ADL, who was kind of instrumental in this book, many of them had been rescued as children, and they felt, Elie Wiesel was actually also at the forefront, that it was a very important part of Holocaust studies and of remembrance to pay tribute and to recognize these people, because that they're it is an important part, and it is a very undertold story that needs more attention. I mean, you will never. The vast majority of the literature and the focus on the Holocaust is rightfully on the horrible things that happened. That was what was probably the nadir of human civilization. So there never is going to be, enough anything close to that on rescue. But rescue is generally, undercovered. And I think there's a few reasons we need to change that. First of all, I think in general, as Golda Meir, the quote that I said, the Jewish people in particular, but I think the world as a whole, owes these people a debt of gratitude for what they did. They, are about the only way you can restore hope in humanity when you learn the history of the Holocaust. And it is, in my view, a historical injustice, for example, that everybody knows who Heinrich Himmler is, and everyone knows who Hermann Goering is, but nobody knows who Aristides de Souza Mendes is, who I'll talk about in 1 second, who saved 30,000 people over the course of 3 weeks. I do think it's really important for children as a way of, because, and as you'll see, early childhood is the most important part of kind of what made rescuers do what they did, and also what we can learn, to apply today. And for not just children, but also like anybody, there's a tendency to turn away from the Holocaust because it is so horrific. I mean, there've been 40 genocides since then, but there's something about the Shoah that is kind of unique. And I have a friend who made a documentary film about a town called Le Chambon that I write about, and he refers to the rescuers, uses an analogy of sort of a banister that you can hold on to when you think about the Holocaust. And I think that is very important, because, like, even if you look at what happened in Israel and the footage that's circulating, I mean, many people find it very difficult to look that in the eye, and you hear what happened, but it's very hard to see it. And that's just part of human nature. And so, by starting with the good, and again, particularly with children, you can start to talk about what actually happened, and you can talk about the bad and how it should never happen again. I remember after 9/11, they brought Mr. Rogers out of retirement. They said to him, "How do you talk to children?" And he said, "Look to the helpers." And I think that to me is what the rescuers are. And then most importantly, I think there are the lessons that we can take from why people did this individually, and why people did this as a group, and what we can do then to encourage this kind of behavior, and also encourage communities, because there were a number of communities, which I'll talk about, that were able to actually save all of their Jews. And that was pretty unusual. So people are often interested in kind of like, are there commonalities among the rescuers? And the answer is yes and no. There was a one Freudian study that was done by husband and wife that were Holocaust survivors. And they found out that when they surveyed rescuers, that really the only thing they could find that was strongly correlated was how you were disciplined as a child, whether your parent like beat you or whether you were disciplined in a loving, caring way. But that's not entirely satisfying. But other kind of interviews, and I've gone through thousands of these cases now, and there are definitely things that jump out that I think it's worth spending a minute on understanding. What they were and what goes into what they call the altruistic personality. So universally, I would say to kind of cut to not bury the lead. The universally, almost every rescuer that I've seen had in early childhood some role model, usually a parent, sometimes both parents, who did a couple of things. One is that, which is probably the more obvious thing, is that they generally taught them, exposed them to people other than themselves. They were said, you shouldn't hate, the community of mankind. Also, like Irena Sendler, who is one of my chapters, who saved 2,500 Jewish children and infants from the Warsaw Ghetto. Her father was a doctor who treated. He died actually when she was 8, treating caught typhus from poor Jews that he treated. And he told her, if you see someone drowning, you must help them. So there was sort of that message from the, usually again the parents, but could be other role model. The other thing that most rescuers actually grew up in loving homes, where their interests were fostered, where they where they were valued. And that leads to strong self-esteem. And that actually was critical for being a rescuer, because if you think about it, you have to be somebody who is looking at the entire world around them, where everyone is doing something else, whether it's collaborating or just standing by. And you have to feel that you have a strong enough moral compass that not only are you willing to act against the grain, but you're actually confident enough to think that the action you're going to take will actually make a difference and that you'll be effective. So that by far was the most important. One thing that is completely not correlated is educational achievement. In fact, if anything, it might have been negatively correlated. Everyone at the Wannsee conference, where the final solution was decided, every one of the Nazis either had a PhD or a law degree. So education did not correlate with rescue. But what did, so, people in creative professions, people who had international careers, these kinds of people who were in touch with people different than themselves, had friends who were different than themselves, they tended to be rescuers. People who were more tolerant. The most common thing was the belief in something greater than oneself, and almost always that was religion. I mean, it could have been something else. Could have been belief in liberal democracy, like the White Rose, although they were religious as well. It could be belief in nonviolence. I have a chapter about a pastor and his wife who were major figures in the nonviolent movement. In Albania, the only country where there were more Jews at the end of the war than at the beginning of the war, there was a very very ingrained culture of hospitality. But it was generally religion, and what it was in terms of religion, because that could cut both ways, was it was people who were not interested in religion for external displays of piety and to show how moral they were, but people who really internalized the teachings of faith, whether it was Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Muslim. Probably the parable of the Good Samaritan saved more Jews than anything else in Europe during World War II. So these were people who really believed in love thy neighbor as thyself, and like the community of mankind, and that's I think really important. Another sort of personality trait is that almost all of the rescuers were modest almost to a fault. They always, the testimony is almost eerily consistent. I didn't do anything special. I did the decent thing. I did what anybody else would have done. I did just what any ordinary person would have done. And of course, that's completely not true. The guy on the left who was in this town, Deschambon, gave his life when he was like 30, 31. He was basically a housemaster, and he was rounded up with a bunch of teenagers, and he did all that he could to kind of keep them calm. And he eventually was sent east and died. He was not Jewish, obviously, but he was writing his parents even after he'd been captured. Like, I had found my calling, taking care of these children, and I mean, just like amazing people who, again, didn't felt it, unremarkable by what they did. Another thing is very noteworthy is that many of them suffered for what they did. Oskar Schindler had rocks thrown at him in the streets of Germany after the war. Someone called him like a Jew lover, and he hit the guy, and then the guy sued him, and he had to pay him a fine. And there are many reasons why these people had very difficult lives, including in the United States after the war. Part of it was anti-Semitism didn't disappear with the Allied victory. People still didn't like Jews after the war. Many of them were very angry at the rescuers because they said, you could have brought, danger to our community. Why did you help the Jews? Nobody likes them. Much of, many of the worst episodes in the Holocaust took place in what became behind the Iron Curtain. And there was an added problem that if you were a rescuer, you were considered suspect and likely sympathetic to the Allies and anti-communist, and there was institutional anti-Semitism. So you had many people who literally were awarded the title of righteous among the nations, but who did not ever come forward until after the Berlin Wall fell. And then I think that really the main reason deep down why these people were really hated after the war by their neighbors was that, it's very difficult to say, I couldn't do anything when you live next to somebody who risked their life to save, people who were being persecuted. So rescuers, I think, were very inconvenient, and that led to them being quite hated. So I'll just, I know I tend to chat too much, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. But I'll give you a few examples of a couple of stories, and then I want to spend a minute on kind of community rescue, and then we can kind of hopefully have a conversation. I mentioned, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who I mentioned earlier. If people ask me who's your favorite rescuer, I feel like I shouldn't answer that question. It's like being asked who's your favorite child. But I'll say the Christian Science Monitor, when they reviewed the book, called him the breakout star of the book. And he is worth noting because he is, as I mentioned, he rescued somewhere between probably 10 and 30,000 people. And that makes him the largest individual rescuer as an individual during the entire Holocaust. And yet he's virtually unknown outside of kind of Holocaust studies areas or people who might have been saved by him. One amazing thing that I've experienced since I started writing about rescue is that inevitably when I write an article or I write a story, somebody I know will email me and say, I'm alive today because of this person. And that's where you get the famous line, he who saves one life saves the world. Because today, there's probably hundreds of thousands of people alive today because of this one man. And when you think about the population and he didn't just save Jews, but when you think about the population of Jews in the world and where it's been rebuilt to, a big chunk of that actually owes its life to its origin to rescuers. So I think in the 10 stories that I write about alone, there's probably 1 million people alive because of, again, some of these were mass rescues, of thousands of people. And they all have children and grandchildren, not all, but many of them. And so the rebirth of the Jewish people and the rebirth in Israel is in large part because of the actions of many of these rescuers. Just to give you two, can read the book, hopefully. The story of Sousa Mendes was that he was an aristocratic diplomat. He and his brother were twins. His brother was sort of the rising star in the foreign ministry. He rose up to be foreign minister. Sousa Mendes was a very good diplomat as well, but he was more of a bon vivant. He was a devout Catholic, and when war broke out, so Salazar, who was the dictator of Portugal, is a very Machiavellian, complicated guy who was against parties. He wasn't really a fascist. He hated the communists, but he tended to be more right wing, but his main goal was to keep Portugal out of the war, and therefore he needed to keep Spain out of the war. And so he was very focused on not having any refugees come into Spain. And when France was invaded, there were many people on the run there. The only way out, or one of the few ways out, was over the Pyrenees into Spain and onto Portugal. And if you've seen the movie Casablanca, Lisbon, everyone wanted to get to Lisbon because it was neutral and you could go from there on to the United States or South America or Palestine or elsewhere. So Salazar had sent out in early 1940, late 1939, a circular to all of the embassies basically saying no foreigners are allowed in, with a few exceptions. It was Americans, British, I think French and Belgians if they were famous, and they were very specific: no Jews and no people with no passports, which was basically Jews. And June 1940, Paris falls. There's the largest traffic jam in the history of the world. 5 million people flee south to Bordeaux, where Sousa Mendes was the consul general, which meant he was in charge of visas for not just there, but the surrounding areas. And it was terrible scenes. Literally the Luftwaffe was strafing people overhead. People saw their own families murdered, by machine gun fire. There was a massive refugee crisis in Bordeaux. People were sleeping on the streets. And at the same time, the French government came. The Vichy government was there. De Gaulle was there right before he fled to London to start the Free French. And all these people were going from embassy to consulate to consulate looking for visas, because that was the only way you could get out. And everyone slammed the door, including the United States. And Sousa Mendes, who had a very large family, had 14 children. He had sent most of them back. And he came out one day and he met a young rabbi from Antwerp, originally from Poland, who had a very large family. And he saw all these Jews out in front of the Portuguese consulate. And he said, "Why don't you come inside? Spend the night. You have a big family. My consulate's empty. You shouldn't be sleeping on the street with your children." Now, Sousa Mendes had already been reprimanded for defying this circular a couple of times. He'd given visas to people because he couldn't bear the suffering of people on the run. But now there was a huge crisis. And he brought the rabbi in. They spent the night talking together. And at the end, Sousa Mendes said, "Look, I'd like to help you. I want to give visas to your family." And the rabbi said, "I can't take the visas from you without helping everybody else. I can't leave my fellow Jews." He went back out on the street. Sousa Mendes had what he described, and I've seen the actual, writing that he wrote to his brother, that he said he had basically suffered a nervous breakdown for a couple of days. He took to his bed, and then he got up very dramatically, and he said, "I am going to give a visa to every single person who wants it, regardless of your religion or who you are." And then over the course of the next 3 weeks, because it was a time, ticking time, because people knew that once France capitulated, the door would slam shut, he proceeded to give thousands of visas to people. Among the people he saved were Salvador Dali and his wife, the Habsburgs, the Rothschilds, Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's dealer, Jean-Michel Franck, the designer. I start the book with the story of H.A. and Marguerite Ray escaping Paris with the manuscript to Curious George in their homemade bicycle. Curious George himself, therefore, would have been a casualty of the war, had never been published had it not been for Sousa Mendes. And he did this, and the news got back in an act of supreme pettiness. A British woman showed up at the embassy asking for a normal tourist visa, and she was asked to wait because there were so many refugees, and she complained to her embassy, which called Lisbon. And what followed next was sort of this cat and mouse game where people were sent down from Lisbon, senior level people, to find Sousa Mendes. He moved all over, dodging them, giving out visas. He personally took people across the border, and then the door slammed shut. And for his efforts, he was summoned back to Lisbon, disciplined, had his pension cut. He was recommended to be demoted. The foreign minister overruled that and said, he should have been reprimanded. The foreign minister said he should be demoted. And then Salazar personally sealed his file and said he's fired, no pension. he went through his entire life savings. He was an aristocrat, big home, had to burn his furniture. His wife died prematurely. He had a stroke. He died prematurely. And the Jewish community in Lisbon tried to support him. And there's testimony from a teenager that was working in the soup kitchen. And he said this man came in his diplomatic garb that was very threadbare. And there were two parts of the soup kitchen. One was for, poor Jews, and the other was for Portuguese. That was a little bit nicer. And he said, why don't you go into that part? This other part's for refugees. And Susan Mendez said to him, we're all refugees. And he insisted on eating with the Jews. And he had a wonderful line as well when he, in the middle of all of this, when he was giving the visas out, he said, I would rather stand with God against man than with man against God. So, this, and then he ended up dying very prematurely, kind of penniless. The United States recognized him and Israel recognized him well before Portugal did. Finally, in the late 90s, he was recognized. To add insult to injury, the end of the war, the Port Salazar took credit for what he had done when he saw the handwriting on the wall, and all of a sudden became a ally of the West, became a founding member of NATO. And it wasn't only, now Susan Mendez has been rehabilitated, made an ambassador, he's a national hero, but he died having suffered quite a lot for what he did. I know I'm probably running over soon, so I'll just flip and just tell you a few stories just to whet your appetite. In my book, there's a story of a rescue in a circus. This is the ringmaster and his wife who saved Jews by hiding them in the circus. On the left is Princess Alice, who is King Charles's grandmother, who saved a family of Jews in her palace in Athens during the war. And the Archbishop Damaskinos is the only head of an organized church to protest the Holocaust. My other favorite is probably Gino Bartoli, who was an Italian. He won the Tour de France in 1938, was one of the greatest athletes in the world, most famous athlete in Italy. Never told anybody that he saved this family on the bottom right and some others by hiding them in his home. And he also functioned, which is fascinating, as a bicycle messenger for the underground. And he was in his bicycle, he was hiding false identity papers for Jews. And he probably saved about 700 people as part of this group that way. It's an amazing story. He never told anybody, even though he certainly had a platform. He was one of the most famous people in Italy. He said, some medals you win for cycling, other medals you get for doing good, and you get them in the next life and they're pinned to your soul. Many people know the story of Sugihara. Japanese, really was a spy, saw this image on the left out, very similar to Susan Mendez, saved thousands of Jews. Less known is his partner in the project, who on the left was a Dutch businessman who became honorary consul in Kovno, like 2 days before the Soviet invasion, and he gave people visas to Curacao, and then Sugihara would create the visas that you see on the right, which required all this calligraphy. This is Irena Sendler, who I mentioned earlier, went in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto hundreds of times at the risk of her own life, ran an entire network of mostly teenage girls, both inside and outside the ghetto, ended up saving 2,500 Jewish children and infants and teenagers, was arrested, tortured, almost executed. She was released with a bribe from the underground, literally as she was being marched to her execution. Story was virtually unknown until it was discovered by some high school history students in Kansas. Amazed. She was actually the person who gave Jan Karski the famous tour of the Warsaw Ghetto. So she was really kind of there, like in hell on earth with the Warsaw Ghetto and the death camps in Poland, and again, like risked her life daily to save children. I will briefly mention, and then I will be quiet, but I think it is worth talking about, is community rescue. So these are the people in Denmark, Le Chambon. I mentioned Albania. The thing is, I think it's important. I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal about why is it that some communities were able to save all of their Jews: Denmark, Albania, Finland, Bulgaria, the island of Zakynthos. And some of it was, cultural, long tradition of no bigotry. But a lot of it was the fact that people came together and they viewed the Jews as their neighbors and their friends. And like the Danes, for example, from the day of the initial occupation, they said that we will not permit you to discriminate against our Jews. And the story about the king of Denmark wearing the Jewish star is apocryphal because Danes would never allow the Jews to be discriminated against. And there was an amazing, once even the SS advised against trying to round up the Danish Jews because they knew it would create such a problem because the community was so united in this. During the occupation, the fascist party in Denmark regularly polled less than 2%. So what it showed is that places could stand up to the Nazis. Le Chambon, which you see on the left, was a non-violent town in the Protestant area of France that saved 5,000 Jewish people, 3,500 children, gave them a regular life during that. Many of were interviewed. You see, these are kids who are there. It was like camp. Camus was in the next town writing The Plague. This was a hotbed of resistance, and yet almost nobody didn't survive, and in a place where nonviolence was the credo. And again, it's really important to think about this, and if people have questions, we can talk more about it. But I think what's really important is two things. One is, I think the anti-bullying campaign that people make fun of is actually really important because, as I mentioned earlier, it all starts in early childhood. And if you have a society or a community where everyone stands up and says, if they see someone being bullied, someone stands up against it, and everyone kind of helps, like says, that's not who we stand for, that's where you create these kinds of communities. And that's where hatred can't take root. And, when I talk about rescue, I think people always say, what would I have done? I think it's very hard to judge people in retrospect because, in many places in Europe, if you were caught, not only would they kill you, they would kill your family, including your children. And that's a lot to ask of people. But there are many things that people can do to, help. I mean, many Holocaust survivors remembered just small acts of kindness, giving them the ability to, stay alive. Primo Levi wrote about a man named Lorenzo who gave him soup when he was still interned in Italy. And he said, that man kept me alive because I knew somebody still thought I was a human being. And there's a wonderful quote from a man in Holland who was one of these amazing people that risked their life for people, in many cases they didn't even know or even like. And he said, we were the tip of the spear, but what made it possible in places like Holland versus a place like Poland for people to be that effective was that most of the people around them sympathized with what they were doing. So even if they weren't going to put their own life on the line, sort of, they would look the other way if they saw rescue or the community support around them. And obviously that's something everybody could have done. And if everybody had done that, you would have had many more places like Denmark or Albania. And I think these are really important lessons for us to think about today, the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of bigotry, polarization, and kind of thinking about, again, because I mentioned there's 40 genocides since World War II. So the idea of never again is not real yet. It's aspirational. And if anything, feels like we're backsliding. So, other stories in my book, the famous Varian Fry story, rescuing most of the artists and writers from, this is his team. All of these people, despite what they look like here, were very young at the time. They saved basically almost the entire intelligentsia of Europe. The entire, center of the art world moved from Paris to New York. Many of the writers came to New York and Los Angeles. Interestingly, the day Hitler got into power, the first thing he did was he stripped 13 people of their citizenship. They were all writers who were critical of the Nazis, some Jewish, some not. And this is a story I tell of a recount of 10 British POWs saving one 16-year-old girl in the Death March. And I included that for a variety of reasons, but in part also to show that, in some cases, you had somebody like Sousa Mendes who saved maybe 30,000 people, but in other cases, you had 10 people here come together at the very end of the war when they didn't need to do it. They were about to be liberated, and to save one young girl at the risk of all of their lives. So I will pause here. I was asked to keep it to less than I spoke, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for the research, for sharing these stories. And, at least for me, I can't help but feel moved and inspired and convicted. So thank you for that. So we do have a few moments for questions, and we have a few that have already come in, so we'll start there. But I also invite any people that are here for tonight's lecture, please add your questions. So let's start with a few people have asked, how did you decide which rescuers to include in this particular book, knowing that there's thousands of these stories?
Yeah, so it was very difficult. And actually, my original proposal was for there would have been 15 chapters, and the book was going to would have been way too long. So it was difficult to choose. I tried to. So I had a couple things. I first of all, I had a few ground rules, which was I really wanted the book to be about people who were on the ground doing the rescue. And so I talk in the introduction about some other people, but I didn't include, for example, like political leaders. People know like, Churchill, but, Herbert Hoover was great. Manuel Quezon, who was the president of the Philippines, Thomas Dewey, people who spoke out. There were people in Hollywood. There was a pageant that went around called We Shall Never Die, that was written by Ben Hecht, but there were a lot of non-Jewish stars in it, like Frank Sinatra, and they were trying to Burgess Meredith bring like attention to what was going on, because people have a misunderstanding that we really knew a lot more than we think we did in retrospect. I didn't include any Jewish rescuers. I just wrote an article for the Boston Globe about Nicky Winton. A lot of people know his story because it's there's a movie coming out with Anthony Hopkins, and it's this, if you've seen the video of him later in life, all of the children he rescued 667 children on the kinder transport, and later they surprised him in it. But his parents were Jewish, and so I didn't include Jewish rescuers. And then I wanted to give sort of a cross section of the types of rescue that went on in Europe. So both geographically, so there are stories in France and Italy and those British POWs, Poland, Greece, Lithuania. So tried to give geographic context, as well as different types of people. So, as I mentioned, a rescue in the circus, a Polish social worker, Princess Alice, whose story is much more interesting than her great-grandson, Prince Harry. This book did very well, but his story, this story is much more interesting. So, different types of people, different motivations for rescue. So there's the story again of people, the nonviolent community that was also Protestant. They were the descendants of Huguenots who themselves had been persecuted. They continue the tradition of protecting refugees to this day. There are Ukrainian, there are Afghan refugees living in that town. So it was people who were motivated by religion. So it was meant to give sort of a cross section, and then all of the stories, to me, were, had some sort of color or sort of cinematic quality to them that made them really interesting stories on their own. Obviously, World War II is one of the most dramatic moments in history. And so they were, at the end of the day, I guess, stories that sort of spoke to me, and that I thought, were particularly worth telling. But it was a bit of a pain. I could have written 3 books this length easily with stories that were similarly inspirational. So that was probably the hardest part of the book, was narrowing it down. And I encourage people to, I continue to write some of these stories. I encourage people to, look at some of the stories I mentioned, or other stories that are out there. There are other stories from other genocides. I actually spent 2 hours with the man from Hotel Rwanda, who saved 1,600 people during that. It was like talking to somebody out of my book. There's things coming out now about people trying to save Jews on October 7th. So we will get more stories like that.
Someone did ask if you're considering writing additional books focused in this way, or at this point, will it just be kind of additional stories that you write?
Yeah, I don't know yet. I am working on another book. My next book actually takes place in Rome, but and I have written some other stories for that weren't in the book. I mentioned the King of Morocco. I just wrote a story about a guy named Roddy Edmonds, who's an American who saved 200 Jewish American soldiers. People don't realize the Nazis. I didn't know this until I knew his story. The Nazis were separating out Jewish soldiers and sending them east, and many of them didn't come back. And this guy was in a camp where he was the highest ranking. He was a non-commissioned officer. He was from Tennessee in his 20s. Probably had never met a Jew before he enlisted. And when the Jews, after the Battle of the Bulge, there were 1,200 Americans showed up, were in this camp, and they came over the loudspeaker and they said, all Jews report in front of the barracks tomorrow. And this guy, Roddy Edmonds, said, we're all going out. So he stood at the front, they all went out. There were 200 Jews in the group. And the commandant like turned red, came over and started screaming at him. He said, these cannot all be Jews. And he said to him, we're all Jews here. So the guy took out his Luger, pointed it at his head and said, you're going to tell me who the Jews are, I'm going to shoot you. And he said to him, and there were many witnesses, and he said, if you shoot me, you better kill all of us because the war's almost over and you're going to be hanged for war crimes. So the commandant turned red, put his gun away and walked off. This guy never told anybody. The story came out after his death because his granddaughter was doing a report for school and her father's a pastor. And they found an article in the New York Times where one of these guys he'd saved said, yeah, there was this guy, Roddy Edmonds was my officer and he saved my life in the camp. And so he's been honored by Yad Vashem. He's one of 5 Americans, but amazingly, there's legislation that every year does not go through Congress because they can't get enough votes to give him the Congressional Medal of Honor. And the Army is taking the position that he doesn't get the Medal of Honor because what he did was not in combat. It was in a POW camp, even though he had a gun pointed at his head by a German officer. So I wrote an article about this for Time recently, trying to right this wrong because the guy should be honored by the United States and not just by Israel. So there are lots of stories. So I probably do have it in me. The book's been an option for a documentary series. So yes, I continue to be interested, but I have no plans at the moment for a sequel. But there are, again, it could be an encyclopedia.
Mhm. So just, I'm going to ask one more question. It'll be kind of our last one. So the slides that you had are very striking in terms of the summary of what can you see about the individuals and what can you see about the communities who were rescuers. And I'm just wondering if you see a way, what do you want done with that information? It seems like very important information about how we sort of why we would want to put our energies around healthy families and something of encouraging people to internalize their ethics and how they're motivated in life, or the communities around their tradition of no bigotry, right? These are like roadmaps, and I'm just wondering if you yourself have had thoughts around what to do with that information.
Yeah, I mean, I've addressed like audiences of young people, recently, and I think these stories are, appeal to them. So I think, like, again, who we value as a society, I think, is really important. So I think telling these stories and making sure people know about them, I think, is really important as part of the project that you're describing, which is obviously much more ambitious, to try to, get people to feel that they want to do the right thing, or that as a community they stand for the right thing, and that's the default position. So with respect to my book and the lessons from it, I'm trying to talk to as many people as possible. And if I could choose one audience, it would be younger people. I think these people should be part of the curriculum. And again, there are things like Facing History, which does a great job with that. And I think, again, who we value is really important. So I think we don't do a very good job today, even, with valuing people who do things like this. It's obviously like old, truism about, like, the news or the media it's always negative. And it's not that these are all positive stories, because obviously they're positive because there's something very negative going on in the background, right? But I do think it would be great if we valued people who are selfless and do things for others, and if people were rewarded at a young age for doing that. and that if we did a better job of teaching people to, respect one another and help one another. I mean, it sounds very, banal to say that, but these are extreme examples, right? And so, and it's not been systematically done. And again, I think the thing that was like, most interesting to me again was what made people do this, and then what made these communities do it. Because like, again, even when you have an example of a community that, was nonviolent and stood up to the Nazis and successfully did it, there's really a lesson to learn there, because that's like an extreme laboratory that we're talking about. So I think it all starts with education, and that understanding history and understanding how different people made choices at this really unusual moment in time, which, as bad as we're living through now, was worse. I think we can take a lot of hope from that. And one other thing I'd say is, like, I had a fascinating experience of interviewing a lot of the children of the righteous, and I often get asked about that. And it was a mixed bag. Some people loved their parents, people hated their parents, some people were in the middle. And I found that really actually hopeful, because these people weren't saints. They were, you don't have to be a saint to be a hero. They were just people that were put in, really unusual, difficult circumstances and rose to the occasion when most people didn't. And I think ultimately, if we can create a society where more people will do that, that's good. And that's how the world gets better.
Thank you so much.
By the way, somebody did ask, I think, the name of the maintenance man who turned on the students. I do feel like I should answer that. His name was Jakob Schmid, and I say that because I never forget it, because it was so terrible what he did. So,
yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, for being part of the Kristallnacht lecture series. And at this time, I will turn it back over to Julie for announcements and closing.
Thank you again to Richard and to Sandra and the team at the University of La Verne. This was an amazing talk, and I can't wait to finish the book personally. Before we close, I'd like to give you a few announcements. In addition to this being our 25th annual book festival, it's also our 30th anniversary of our Jewish Federation, which has brought this book festival, other cultural programs, and the PJ Library to our Jewish community, all while being the voice of our Jewish community as well. Please look for some of these events throughout the year that will celebrate our anniversary. And please attend our future book festival events. The next is a brunch at the Altadena Town and Country Club with a book of mystery titled Mother-Daughter Murder Night by Nina Simon. It's a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, and that will be on Wednesday the 15th. And then there is our One Book, One Community selection, Incident at San Miguel by A.J. Sidransky, taking place at Temple Sinai of Glendale. I hope to see you there. Thank you once more, and have a wonderful evening.